One crisp Saturday morning, Daniel Morgan awoke to find his once pristine garden transformed into a chaotic mess, a parking lot of sorts, created by a vehicle that did not belong there. As the first gentle rays of dawn illuminated his front yard, Daniel discovered a dark, battered SUV parked squarely in the center of his carefully maintained green space. For years, his garden had been a labor of love, a living testament to hard work, care, and the quiet pride of raising a sanctuary for his family. Today, it was marred by an intrusion that felt both personal and invasive. Still in disbelief, Daniel hesitated only momentarily before seeking assistance from the local homeowners association. He made his way inside to confront the association chairperson, Julia Stone, a woman renowned for her rigid adherence to rules and an air of unwarranted superiority. However, when Daniel explained the situation, Julia merely smiled smugly and waved off his concerns, relying on her bureaucratic authority to dismiss what she deemed a trivial matter. Daniel knew then that things were not as simple as they appeared. While Julia exuded confidence in her ability to keep things in order, she remained blissfully unaware that Daniel had already begun documenting every detail of the unauthorized parking. As the morning unfolded, the peaceful neighborhood scene, usually marked by the sound of chirping birds and the gentle rustle of leaves, was now undercut by the tense reality of property rights violated. Daniel, a proud veteran and devoted father, stood on his porch with a cup of steaming coffee in hand. The beauty of his garden, which had long been a symbol of stability and personal achievement, was suddenly overshadowed by a profound sense of injustice. The intruder's SUV, with its dusty windows and a dented bumper, contrasted sharply with the sparkling dew on his meticulously trimmed hedges. Daniel's mind raced through questions: who would park without permission on his property? Was it a careless neighbor, or was there something more sinister at play? Despite the shock and mounting frustration, he resolved to take action. Quietly, with a determined glint in his eyes, he began to gather evidence. Every step, from snapping photos with his phone to noting the position of tire marks, was a part of his plan to expose the truth behind this blatant disregard for property boundaries. In that early hour, as the neighborhood was slowly awakening, Daniel understood that his fight was not just about a single car parked on his lawn. It was about respect for private property, for one's home and the sanctity it represents. What began as a minor inconvenience was rapidly evolving into a symbol of a larger problem. The unchecked power of an overbearing HOA and its equally dismissive enforcers. His resolve to document and, ultimately, contest the infringement marked the beginning of a personal crusade, a stand not only for his rights but for all those who believed that living in peace meant having one's home respected. Daniel Morgan's morning routine had always been sacrosanct, his early hours reserved for quiet reflection as he sipped his coffee on the porch, admiring the fruits of years of tender care in his garden. That particular Saturday, however, his habitual moments of peace were shattered by the unsettling presence of the dark SUV parked conspicuously amid the lush foliage that he had nurtured. As beams of sunrise cascaded across his yard, the intruding vehicle stood like an unwelcome interloper, a blot upon his well-ordered haven. With his heart heavy and his mind reeling with disbelief, Daniel slowly approached his property. His gaze, filled with both determination and sorrow, traced the outlines of broken blades of grass and deep tire imprints that disrupted the symmetry of his once flawless lawn. Each mark was a physical reminder of a boundary that had been crossed, a personal affront that he could not and would not ignore. Unable to contain his mounting frustration, Daniel resolved to confront the root of the invasion. He knew that the unruly parking would not remedy itself. In his mind, the violation symbolized something far beyond mere property misuse. It was a breach of trust, an affront that demanded accountability. Determined, Daniel reached out to his neighbor, hoping to obtain some clarity about the unauthorized vehicle. With measured steps and a quiet dignity honed by years of disciplined living, he made his way to the residence of Eric Turner, known in the block for his brusque, uncompromising manner and a habit of dismissing common courtesies. At Eric's door, Daniel knocked firmly. When the door creaked open, he was met by Eric's unmistakable air of impatience, informal attire, a haphazard expression of annoyance, and arms crossed in clear defiance. In a terse exchange laden with both confusion and underlying disdain, Daniel inquired if the SUV belonged to Eric. Without a hint of apology, Eric curtly confirmed that the vehicle was indeed his, offering an offhand remark about the availability of parking space, as though the intrusion was no more than a trivial oversight. Stunned and incensed by Eric's blatant disregard for the sanctity of Daniel's property, the situation weighed heavily on him. The conversation was not merely about a piece of metal obstructing a garden, it was about respecting personal boundaries. Returning to his porch, Daniel's eyes searched the horizon for any sign that his beloved garden might heal. Yet the disarray was unmistakable, further tire tracks had marred the soil and the foliage bore the scars of careless abandonment. Even as he absorbed the damage with a mounting sense of injustice, Daniel's resolve crystallized. He knew that he could not allow this transgression to stand unchecked. His heart insisted that he must defend his haven, a haven that provided a serene backdrop to family memories, where his children played and laughter once filled the air. And so, with a determined glint in his eyes, Daniel began his quiet investigation. He started by taking photographs of every mile of disfigured lawn, capturing the raw evidence of Eric's transgressions. In that pivotal morning, as the sun rose higher and dispelled the lingering shadows of intrusion, Daniel Morgan silently vowed that he would fight for his home. What seemed at first an isolated incident was quickly taking on the form of a personal battle against the erosion of respect and individual rights. His once tranquil refuge was now a battleground. A place where the principle of property rights was under siege, and where Daniel would soon stand firm as its guardian. After the shock of the initial intrusion had begun to fade, Daniel Morgan knew that inaction would only embolden those who disrespected his sanctuary. The blatant disregard by Eric Turner was more than a mere misjudgment, it was a deliberate affront to the dignity of personal space, and Daniel was determined to hold him accountable. With a firm resolve born of countless moments defending his home, Daniel set out to document every infringement with meticulous care. Returning to his garden, Daniel retraced his steps, his steady fingers running over the broken tendrils of grass and the deep, rugged tire marks that carved a visible path of contempt across his property. Every impression was a testament to the ongoing violation, a silent witness to Eric's cavalier attitude. Resolute, he began capturing high-resolution photographs and shooting several videos with his digital camera, focusing intently on the unmistakable evidence of trespassing. This was not just a one-time mistake. It was a recurring travesty that needed irrefutable documentation. Determined to gather evidence that would leave no room for doubt, Daniel installed a series of discrete surveillance cameras around the perimeter of his garden. He positioned each device with deliberate precision, ensuring that every inch of his property was under vigilant watch. The cameras were not an expression of paranoia, but a practical measure to capture any future transgressions, should Eric or anyone else dare disrupt his cherished peace again. For Daniel, each recording was a shield, a silent affirmation that his rights would be defended with the truth as his ally. As the day wore on, the evidence mounted. The gathered video footage, replete with clear images of Eric's car encroaching on Daniel's property, painted an undeniable picture of repeated violations. At every angle, the recordings echoed Daniel's belief, respect for one's boundaries was fundamental. His disappointment with Eric had grown into a full-blown personal crusade, a fight to reclaim his space and uphold the principles of mutual respect in the neighborhood. With the accumulated evidence stored securely on his laptop and backed up on multiple drives, Daniel felt a newfound sense of empowerment. The cameras, the photographs, and the meticulous logs of the incident transformed his frustration into a clear, actionable plan. He prepared to confront the issue not only directly with Eric Turner but also with the local homeowners association, where he anticipated that chairperson Julia Stone's dismissive attitude would now be challenged by irrefutable proof. In that quiet afternoon marked by the diligent hum of his camera's shutter and the steady recording of evidence, Daniel Morgan reaffirmed his commitment to protecting his home at all costs. The battle lines had been drawn, not merely against an inconsiderate neighbor, but against a systemic disregard for personal boundaries. His preparations were the first step toward reclaiming the respect his property, and his life, deserved, setting the stage for the escalation that was soon to come. By mid-morning, the peaceful routine of Daniel Morgan's property had been irrevocably shattered. The evidence of the unwanted intrusion was no longer a single misplaced vehicle, it had transformed into a pattern of neglect and blatant disrespect. The first hints of devastation had appeared the previous day, when Daniel discovered deep tire impressions and patches of trampled grass on his once pristine lawn. Determined not to let the boundary violation slide, he had taken every measure to document the damage. Now, having compiled irrefutable evidence, Daniel knew the time had come for decisive action. That very morning, still reeling from the sight of his scarred garden, Daniel checked the security footage with a heavy heart. The recordings unmistakably captured Eric Turner's black SUV, parked repeatedly in the middle of his cherished green space. Every detail, the worn-out bumper, the dusty windows, the precise location of the vehicle, was recorded and backed up on his laptop. With a mind resolute and steady, Daniel reread his notes, each entry reinforcing his determination that this was not merely a mistake but a recurring violation of his property rights. Armed with his documented evidence, Daniel decided that the only way to restore control and respect for his home was to take the matter beyond personal confrontation. After all, he had attempted a polite inquiry at Eric Turner's door earlier, but that encounter only confirmed his suspicions of callous disregard. With no alternative left, Daniel picked up the phone and contacted a local towing service, explaining in crisp detail how a vehicle that was not authorized to be on his property had, time and again, infringed upon his rights. Within 30 minutes, a tow truck with a rumbling engine arrived at the scene. Daniel watched from his front porch as the truck positioned itself carefully, its lights blinking steadily in the soft glow of the morning sun. He could feel his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally reclaiming what was rightfully his. With a deliberate nod to the truck driver, Daniel provided the exact coordinates and a brief rundown of the situation. The driver, his face set in a professional yet indifferent expression, began the procedure of hooking Eric Turner's SUV onto the tow truck's lift. Almost immediately, the sound of the truck's hydraulic mechanism filled the air as the vehicle was slowly dislodged from its unauthorized spot. From his vantage point, Daniel could see the shadows of neighbors peering curiously from behind their curtains and over garden hedges. Their silent support bolstered his resolve, even as an unmistakable tension crackled in the air. Within minutes of the tow truck's arrival, Eric Turner emerged from his house, his face quickly shifting from sleepy confusion to an unmistakable scarlet rage. Storming out with a fury that could set the very pavement trembling, Eric launched into a tirade. "What do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, gesturing wildly at the scene of his car being loaded onto the truck. "You can't just call someone's tow, this is outrageous." His voice carried across the quiet street, drawing further attention from onlookers. Daniel stepped forward calmly, his voice measured yet unyielding. "Actually, I do have every right," he responded. "Your SUV has been trespassing on my property for weeks, and I've documented every single instance. I've consulted with my attorney, and legally, you must move any vehicle parked on my lawn without permission." His words, though calm, resonated with the firmness of someone who had long defended his home against such blatant abuses. Eric's face contorted with indignation as he waved a dismissive hand. "This is just a minor issue," he snapped, though his tone betrayed his underlying anxiety. Yet, the tow truck driver continued his work without a pause, steadily lifting the SUV as if the incident were nothing more than a routine call. As the last part of Eric's vehicle disappeared from view, a tangible silence replaced the clamor of angry words. Daniel stood rooted on his porch, watching the truck retreat with his neighbor's SUV in tow. Despite Eric's furious shouts fading into the distance, the sting of his dismissiveness and the ongoing disregard for his property rights echoed deeply within Daniel. That moment marked a turning point. No longer would Daniel tolerate unchecked intrusion and the exploitation of lax HOA oversight. Even as he surveyed the damage to his lawn, he felt a surge of vindication. The impoundment of Eric's car was only the first step in a larger journey toward reclaiming his home and establishing the respect that every property owner is entitled to receive. With resolve steeling his heart, Daniel Morgan knew his fight had only just begun. Following the tow, the news of the impounded SUV quickly spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, setting the stage for the ultimate showdown with the homeowners association. Daniel Morgan, still reeling from the personal violation of his property, knew that taking this matter directly to the HOA was inevitable. His resolve was already forged from weeks of documenting Eric Turner's repeated offenses, and the impoundment had provided the final piece of incontrovertible evidence needed to present his case. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at the HOA office armed not only with his photographic evidence and detailed logs but also with a calm yet determined demeanor that contrasted sharply with the earlier chaos. The office, usually a sterile room lined with certificates and community awards, now felt like the final battleground where the future of neighborhood respect would be decided. Sitting down across from Julia Stone, the self-assured and notoriously inflexible chairperson, Daniel began to recount the series of events with precision and clarity. "Julia, I've documented every instance of unauthorized parking on my property," Daniel stated, sliding a thick envelope filled with printed photographs, time-stamped digital copies, and witness statements across the table. His voice was steady, yet underneath lay the raw emotion of countless sleepless nights and mounting frustration. "Eric Turner's SUV has trespassed on my lawn repeatedly, and now, after today's tow, I have no doubt that his behavior is not an isolated mistake but part of a pattern of negligence and disrespect." Julia's expression remained unchanged for the first few moments, her smile fixed in that self-important manner that had long masked her indifference. "Daniel, we have rules in place for a reason. This might seem like a personal affront to you, but on a broader scale, these are minor issues that should be resolved through neighborly discussion," she replied dismissively, tapping her pen on a stack of papers. Her tone was condescending, as if she were speaking to a child rather than a grown man who was defending his sacred property. But Daniel was not about to let her patronizing attitude derail his pursuit of justice. "With all due respect, Julia, this isn't about minor disagreements. It's about the complete disregard for personal property and boundaries. I've gathered more than enough evidence to show that this isn't a one-time incident, it's a systemic problem," he responded firmly. Around them, a few residents had gathered in the hallway, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Daniel's evidence, backed by community testimonials and the physical proof of tire tracks and lawn damage, painted a stark picture. While some neighbors may have turned a blind eye to petty rule violations for the sake of community harmony, the reality was that unchecked trespassing was undermining the very spirit of the neighborhood. Julia sighed, clearly flustered as she glanced at the evidence she could no longer dismiss. "I understand that you're upset, Daniel," she said in a slightly softened tone, "but we must consider the overall impact on neighborhood harmony." Yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty as several of the neighbors began murmuring in agreement with Daniel's point of view. Determined to turn the tide, Daniel elaborated, "If we allow disrespect for property lines to continue unchecked, what's next? Today it's an SUV parked on my lawn, tomorrow it could be unauthorized modifications, or even property damage that can't be so easily rectified. Boundaries exist for a reason, and I'm asking for our community to stand up for each other." As the meeting progressed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Some residents, who had long harbored private frustrations over similar issues, began to voice their own concerns. Stories emerged of forgotten repairs, unauthorized renovations, and overlooked violations that had eroded the trust within the community. The evidence that Daniel presented was compelling enough to force Julia to reconsider the situation, and whispers of dissatisfaction grew louder. Over the next hour, Daniel's determination and clear documentation began to sway the meeting. His calm, persistent arguments shamed those who had once defended the status quo. In a rare moment of candor, one of the residents even stood up to say, "I, too, have experienced this neglect. It's time we hold someone accountable." The collective sentiment became undeniable. By the close of the meeting, despite Julia's initial reluctance, the HOA board was forced to acknowledge that Daniel's case was more than just a personal feud, it was a symptom of a larger systemic issue. The impounded SUV, the damaged lawn, and his impeccable records had turned the tide in his favor. With a final, measured nod, Julia conceded that the board would take appropriate action against Eric Turner, and vowed to review their policies to ensure that all residents' property rights were respected. For Daniel Morgan, the showdown at the HOA was more than just a victory against a negligent neighbor, it was a step toward restoring dignity and accountability to his community. Leaving the office, he felt a renewed sense of hope that the fight for respect was making progress, even if only a small victory had been won that day. After the contentious HOA meeting, news of Daniel Morgan's stand and the subsequent impoundment of Eric Turner's SUV rapidly spread throughout the community. In the days that followed, what had started as a personal battle evolved into a rallying cry for every resident tired of the disregard for their property rights and personal dignity. For many long-suffering homeowners, Daniel's actions had become the spark that ignited a long-dormant spirit of collective defiance. At first, the whispers in the neighborhood were cautious and hesitant, a few sympathetic nods exchanged over garden fences, and wary glances through curtained windows. Yet, as more residents became aware of the mounting evidence that Daniel had so meticulously compiled, a sense of solidarity began to replace the atmosphere of resignation. People started recounting their own similar experiences, stories of unauthorized renovations, reckless parking, and constant fines imposed by a domineering HOA that turned a blind eye to the everyday injustices faced by the community. Encouraged by this newfound support, Daniel took further action. He started by organizing informal gatherings in the local park, where residents could openly discuss their grievances. At these meetings, the message was simple yet powerful: respect for one's property was not negotiable, and unchecked authority would no longer be tolerated. We deserve to live without fear of our own homes being disrespected by those who claim to protect us, Daniel declared at one such meeting, his voice steady and impassioned as he addressed a crowd that had swelled with every passing day. Outside, the small group grew as more neighbors revealed their long-kept frustrations. Slowly but surely, a coalition began to form, a united front against the oppressive practices of the HOA. Local community leaders, previously reluctant to step forward, now found themselves emboldened by Daniel's resolve and the overwhelming evidence of recurring violations. Their solidarity was not born merely of a desire for punitive measures, but from the deep-seated need for fairness and accountability in a system that had long favored those in power over the rights of ordinary homeowners. On one particularly clear afternoon, as the summer heat lent an unusual tension to the air, a group of residents convened right outside the headquarters of the HOA. They carried copies of Daniel's records, photographs, video clips, and handwritten logs, and shared them with anyone willing to listen. Their voices, once meek and measured, now rang out in unison as they recounted stories of past abuses that had been swept under the rug for the sake of community harmony. Meanwhile, the local media caught wind of the unfolding drama. Neighborhood blogs, social media pages, and even a few local news outlets began to feature Daniel's story, framing it as a battle for homeowners' rights against an overreaching board led by the aloof Julia Stone. As the narrative spread, additional evidence emerged from other residents, confirming that the problem was not isolated to Daniel's property. The board's inability to address multiple grievances began to question its legitimacy, forcing even some staunch supporters of the HOA to reconsider their loyalty. Amid the rising tide of public support, Daniel organized a demonstration, a peaceful march through the neighborhood with signs promoting "Respect our space" and "Property rights are not up for debate." Hundreds of residents took to the streets, their voices a resounding declaration that their homes were their sanctuaries, not battlegrounds for arbitrary fines and dismissive authority. The atmosphere was charged with purpose, and in the eyes of everyone involved, it was clear that a deep change was on the horizon. Back at Daniel's home, now a symbol of resistance, neighbors frequently stopped by to express their gratitude. They recounted similar instances in hushed tones, finally relieved that someone had dared to challenge the status quo. Daniel's once solitary battle had transformed into a community movement, one that had begun to tip the scales in favor of justice and respect. In that critical period, as supporters gathered and the public debate reached a fever pitch, the old power of the HOA, long maintained by indifference and favoritism, had begun to crumble. The actions of one determined homeowner had awakened a collective awareness that proved impossible to ignore. With every shared story and every display of unity, Daniel's message grew louder: when a community stands together, even the most entrenched authority can be held accountable. The crescendo of the neighborhood's uprising culminated in a dramatic showdown that not only redefined property rights but also forever altered the balance of power within the community. Following weeks of mounting tension, public protest, and relentless evidence gathering by Daniel Morgan and his allies, the time for final reckoning had arrived. A formal hearing was scheduled to address the long-standing grievances against the HOA's practices, with a special focus on the arbitrary actions of Chairperson Julia Stone and the repeated trespasses by Eric Turner. On the day of the hearing, a palpable excitement mingled with nervous anticipation as residents filed into the community center. The room buzzed with hushed conversations and fervent whispers. Everywhere, copies of Daniel's comprehensive dossier, complete with photographic evidence, video recordings, and written testimonies, sat alongside personal mementos of past abuses. For many, this hearing was not merely about resolving a single dispute, it was about reclaiming dignity and ensuring that the voices of the homeowners would no longer be silenced by dismissive authority. Daniel, dressed in neatly pressed jeans and a simple shirt that belied the depth of his conviction, took the stand with quiet determination. Every detail he recounted was measured, every word deliberate. He presented the timeline of Eric Turner's repeated violations, the unauthorized parking, the visible tire tracks, and the consequential damage to his cherished lawn. His evidence, which had been meticulously collected over several weeks, left no room for ambiguity. Julia Stone, seated at the head of the panel with her usual air of self-assurance, attempted to counter Daniel's claims by citing community rules and guidelines. However, as Daniel proceeded to play key video clips and display high-resolution images that captured every indiscretion, her confident facade began to crumble. The undeniable clarity of the evidence pointed not only to Eric Turner's blatant disregard for property lines but also to a systemic failure on the part of the HOA in enforcing equitable standards. As Daniel continued, his testimony wove together not just a personal narrative of frustration and resolve, but also the collective voice of the community. Neighbors, many of whom had long been too afraid to speak up, rose in support, delivering impassioned statements about their own struggles with arbitrary fines, disrespectful enforcement, and a general lack of accountability from those in power. Their words resonated across the room, echoing the shared sentiment that their homes were sacred, and that no one should be left to endure the whims of an overreaching bureaucracy. The turning point in the hearing came when Daniel played an audio recording of Julia Stone dismissively laughing off another resident's concern during a previous HOA meeting. The recording, filled with casual condescension, struck a chord with everyone present and silenced even the staunchest defenders of the old order. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as jurors and community members alike began to question the integrity of the established regime. By the time the panel delivered its ruling, the evidence had woven an indisputable narrative. Eric Turner was held accountable with steep fines and immediate repercussions for his repeated trespasses, and more importantly, Julia Stone's inability, or unwillingness, to fairly address the community's concerns led to her forced resignation. The new decision also mandated a complete overhaul of the HOA's policies, ensuring greater transparency, fairness, and respect for homeowner rights. In the aftermath of the ruling, a palpable sense of relief and triumph descended over the community. The resounding verdict was not just a victory for Daniel, but a watershed moment for every resident who had ever felt marginalized or disrespected. Neighbors celebrated in small gatherings on sidewalks and in local cafes. Finally, change was not only possible, it was happening. For Daniel Morgan, the hearing was a deeply personal vindication. His painstakingly gathered evidence had not only restored his sense of security but had also ignited a broader movement of empowerment and accountability. As he left the courtroom that day, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden born out of years of quiet suffering now replaced by the light promise of a fairer future. The victory was celebrated with heartfelt applause at the next community meeting. Residents expressed their gratitude and shared stories of prior injustices, affirming that standing up for one's rights had truly made a difference. In that triumphant moment, as the new HOA board was elected on a platform of inclusivity and respect, Daniel Morgan's quiet rebellion had blossomed into a vibrant legacy of community triumph, a legacy that would inspire all who believed in the power of unity and justice.